Cool. Okay, we're here with Dr. Charles Pence today. He's a philosopher of science. We've got some questions about him, and he's going to tell us first about his background.
Yeah, sure. So I got into the field in a kind of circuitous way, actually. So I entered college as a physics major and spent a couple of years working my way toward a physics degree, and kind of started to realize that the questions about science that I was interested in weren't about cranking out more scientific results. That's not the bit that got me wanting to do science. What got me interested in science was we've got this really interesting machine for finding out truths about the universe. How does that thing work? How has it worked in the past? When does it stop working? And that, it turns out, about this time I got very lucky. I got my BA in philosophy from Princeton, and I ran into a philosopher of science who was teaching a logic course there, and took logic with him and got hooked on philosophy of science. Then in the course of grad school, so I got my PhD in history and philosophy of science from the University of Notre Dame 3 years ago now, in 2014. And fell in with a guy there who worked in the philosophy of biology. And I'd worked in a bio lab some. I've done some bacteriology research back in the day. So I was interested in bio, and then sort of realized that actually my favorite part of the philosophy of biology, the dialogue between exciting, interesting practicing biologists and philosophers and historians of biology. It's just a really vibrant, really neat community, and I've had a lot of fun. Had a lot of fun working in it. And so, right out of grad school, I got my job here in the philosophy department at LSU, and I've been plugging away ever since. So that's what brought me here.
All right. And what kind of work have you been involved in here?
Yeah, so I'm a bit eclectic in this regard. So I've got a number of sort of overlapping research projects. So I've got some work in sort of traditional philosophy of biology, and for me, that's really been about the role of chance and statistics in the evolutionary process. This actually comes from having back in the day been really interested in quantum mechanics and physics. So one thing that I noticed when I was getting started in working in the philosophy of biology is, hey, you've got these theories of the natural world. Turns out that almost all of them seem to be inescapably statistical and chancy. Really cool fact. What does that tell us, though, about is it about the theories? What does it tell us about the world? How should we interpret sort of indications of chance and statistics that we see being brought up in the evolutionary sciences? So I've got that sort of research project that I've been working on for a while, and in that context, I've published some stuff on fitness, on natural selection, and on the causal structure of evolutionary theory. I've also got some more historical projects, so I'm really interested in how is it that we started thinking about biology that way? Because, of course, if you go back and read Darwin's Origin of Species, Darwin doesn't use any stats. Darwin has a couple stats books in his library. Stats is still actually pretty much underdeveloped at that point, so there's actually not a lot of tools available for him to really utilize. And it looks like what there is that's available to him, he doesn't much care about it. He's not that interested. You should know there's a book that may be coming out in a couple of years. A colleague of mine at University of Missouri is going to try to convince me that this is false, and I'm excited. I can't wait to read his book. But as I read Darwin, he's just not that interested in this. So that means that there was a historical moment, right, when people said, "Hey, we should start thinking about evolution in terms of statistics and chance." And it turns out that moment is roughly sometime between kind of 1880 and 1930. It's a really cool period in the history of biology. So what I've been doing is going back and looking at some of the work by those authors, trying to understand how it is that happened. What is it that made us decide over the course of the development of early genetics that this was the right way to think about evolution? And then lastly, the other big sort of strain of research that I'm working on here is digital humanities work. So one thing that philosophers of biology often want to do, right? It's very important for us to be able to say, what's going on in the biology literature, right? What do biologists actually think about topic X? You know, if I'm going to come in and try to clarify or try to understand what's happening, say, with the use of fitness in evolution, right? What do biologists actually think about fitness? And philosophers are really good at close reading. You know, we're really good at sitting down with, a couple dozen biology articles, really carefully parceling them out and trying to figure out, okay, this author, by God, I know exactly what this guy means when he uses this concept. That's cool. What I want to then do is load 250,000 journal articles into a computer and use statistical analysis to sort of backstop my argument, right? Here's the close reading that still tells you exactly what I thought it did, but also here's a statistical analysis that says, yeah, these 250,000 articles should also probably be interpreted this way. And that's something that I'm really looking forward to. We've just sort of picked that project up in the last 2 or 3 years. I'm working with my former graduate advisor who's now in Belgium, and that project is really taking on steam, and I'm really excited to see where it goes. So, yeah, that's what I'm up to these days.
Well, yeah, I saw you have a paper outside on organismic fitness.
Yeah, that was so. Sort of my first big bunch of work was in trying to think about. So one thing that philosophers of science are really interested in doing is, one thing that I often, actually, a sort of 5-second description of the philosophy of science that I often give people when they ask is, we're trying to grapple with the questions that biologists are too busy doing their actual jobs to have time to deal with, right? Biologists have very important, very good work to do. They're out looking at particular populations, particular epochs, particular ecosystems, what have you, right? One thing that philosophers of science are really good at is in trying to look at all of that and step way back to really abstract and generalize and try to answer the question, does it make sense to talk about fitness, period, or natural selection, period, or genetic drift, period, in some way that would apply across all different kinds of natural populations? Maybe the answer is that no, there's not. I mean, there are certainly people who are firmly committed pluralists about these kinds of topics, right? They just say, no, look, you tell me what you're interested in, and I'll tell you how to measure it. But until you tell me what you're interested in, you're not going to get anywhere. But a lot of the work that I've done in that connection has been trying to say, yeah, no, there are actually some cases where we can give really general readings of these concepts that help us understand what's going on in evolution. So I really enjoy doing that kind of work.
Wow, that is very interesting. Yeah, there was it Stephen Gould says in Wonderful Life, it's like he's got the pedagogic trick or whatever he is, saying that like Picaya is our distant ancestor, but if we rewound the tape of time, what are the chances that is a contingent event of history? So
the replaying life's tape metaphor is phenomenal. I mean, it's telling that even as often as it's been written about in the philosophy of biology literature, and I could turn to my computer here and print you off probably 24 articles trying to analyze the life state metaphor. It's telling that even in spite of that, it's still a really fertile ground for trying to think about sort of historicity, contingency, path dependence in evolution. How is it that these sort of chancy processes intervene in the evolutionary process? It's really it's an amazing. I mean, we're lucky to have had Gould. I never get tired of reading Gould.
And that segues us into your new book, which is titled Chance in Evolution.
Yeah, so this is a co-authored, co-edited volume. So my again, speaking of my former graduate advisor Grant Ramsey and I edited this book. It's got contributions in it from a wide variety of scholars across the spectrum. So we've got philosophers of biology, we've got historians of biology, there's a theologian, there are a number of practicing biologists, all trying, so all trying to parse the question, what exactly do we mean when we talk about chance and evolution? What do we mean in particular areas? What have we meant over history? In the case of the piece by the theologian, what have we meant when people who are offering theological disagreements in evolutionary theory? What are they? What have they meant when they were saying that it's the chanciness or randomness of evolution that makes people disagree with evolutionary theory? And so in all these cases, right, it seems like we sort of grabbed a common thread and we're trying to tease out sort of across the biosciences and sort of the science studies crowd, what have we all meant by this? And I think it's it turned into a really fun project. I mean, it's sort of the book that I had wished that had been around for me to read it when I started my graduate program. So I mean, I really wanted to kind of get this kind of big, broad survey, and it turns out we had to go, commission it. But it was a lot of fun to put together, and yeah, I strongly recommend it. And I don't just say that. Well, again, I almost certainly don't say that because of my contribution. It's all down to the authors. There's a bunch of really cool chapters in the book. So yeah, it was a lot of fun to get to know some of the people involved in the process.
Yeah, there's some very interesting books that are like that, like John Brockman writes a lot of books like that. He did This Idea Must Die.
Oh yeah, I've seen that, and the Edge people have started doing a lot of those kinds of very broad. Look, we're going to ask everyone from every field that we can think of some kind of, really provocative question. I think there's really something to the idea of pushing for kind of interdisciplinarity and breadth. And that really is, again, you can tell from my training, right? I've got fingers in lots of different disciplines, and that, I think, there's a lot of lip service paid to sort of being interdisciplinary in the contemporary university, and it's hard to pull it off in real life, right? It's hard to figure out how to really actually get projects like that going. And one thing I think that some of these examples show, and I hope that the book shows that, is that evolution's a perfect case study in you really do need these varying perspectives to really start to understand the theory, how we got to where we are now with the theory, where the theory is going to go, what has the public reaction to the theory been like. All of these elements are really important, and they're all super relevant for evolution. It almost seems more so than for many other contemporary scientific theories. So.
Yeah, there was a book that came out fairly recently on public reaction to evolutionary theory. Is public reaction over history. I can't remember what the name of the book was, though. It's like you guys looking at different authors like Asia Gray, and
this is going to drive me crazy too. It's about the early days of the reception of the origin in America proper, right, and the sort of various ands that the book was passed through. These sort of unsung role. Actually, I have a very good friend and close colleague at North Carolina, Charlotte, Trevor Pierce, who's working on a lot of these interesting issues about the role of sort of early American pragmatists in the reception of evolution in America. There's a bunch of really interesting connections here that are really underexplored. Again, late 19th, early 20th century, really cool stuff going on historically. It's just a really fun period to be involved in.
Yeah, it's definitely. And so, do you have any more notes on your background that you want to add?
I don't think so. I think that's good, yeah.
Okay. So I would like to ask you about the first interesting question that I came up with while thinking of this interview, which is, what are your thoughts on Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism?
Good. So yeah, this has become a fairly common trope in evolution circles. So 5-second background just to get kind of everybody on the same page. If you haven't heard this argument, of course you and I have, but the idea goes something like, because evolution selects only for organisms with increased fitness, there's not then any selective drive toward actually producing true beliefs in the heads of organisms like us. So if you've got, Plantinga argues, a sort of naturalistic picture of the evolution of cognitive capacities in humans, then that's going to be inconsistent with believing that we have any true beliefs at all, including your naturalistic belief about the evolution of the cognitive capacities of humans. Now, there's a lot of ways to respond to this. Many of them are interesting, and some of them are even good. But one thing that I want to bracket, because I don't have the time or whiteboard space to get into it, but it's definitely worth looking. A couple of authors, most notably Elliot Sober and Brandon Fiddleson, have written some really good stuff on the probabilistic inferences that underlie arguments like Plantinga's EAAN. Let's just say that there are ways of interpreting those inferences on which the likelihood inferences are pretty suspect. So, right, obviously, top to bottom, that argument's relying on probability, right? So the idea that, look, if you have this one picture versus this other picture, right, a naturalistic versus a non-naturalistic picture of the evolution of cognitive capacities, then you're going to be able to make inferences about the likelihoods of those various pictures. And of course, that's all just a probability. It's all just a probability argument. You have to be very careful with that probability argument. There's lots of ways to do it badly, and so Sober and Fiddleson have teased out a bunch of really interesting ways in which that argument goes wrong. Another, the more sort of radical response, which I can't quite figure out. I haven't worked on this argument enough to know whether or not I want to bite this bullet. But the more radical response is just to say, sure, if that's your definition of truth, then yeah, you're going to have some trouble. What that shows you is that you have an incorrect definition of truth. So Plantinga's got this idea of truth as being absolute, complete, one-to-one correspondence of the contents of your brain case and the outside world. A very simple way to sidestep the entire argument is just to say, it's never what we meant anyway, and you never had that anyway, and if you think you need that, well then yeah, you probably should have a God around to beam it into your head, because you're not going to get it in any other way. So if you take a kind of half step toward a sort of more pragmatist picture of understanding truth, again, this isn't to go all the way to sort of what's true is useful and what's useful is true. You don't have to go that far down the road. But just to soften up the sort of classical correspondence picture of truth, and there's lots of different ways to do that. So, of course, theories of truth are a really old, very deep, very complex area of study in philosophy. One in which, to be perfectly fair, I do not want to claim expertise or competency in. I've vaguely studied a few of these kinds of classic papers. But softening up the correspondence theory is certainly another very, very easy way to sort of matrix dodge the entire argument. Because at that point, if you just say, look, I never wanted those kind of beliefs anyway. I didn't need that tight of a correspondence. What I needed was something weaker. And even with something weaker, I still should be able to say that, yeah, for the right meaning of true, I hold true beliefs. I think probably something like that is my preferred answer, although I wish I had better details to sort of flesh out for you. But there's definitely a lot of room to respond in that kind of way.
Okay. What do you mean by we don't need the one-to-one correspondence?
Well, so there's a lot of precise, the idea that the only thing that you might mean by true is that the sort of detailed propositional content of the beliefs that you have must map on to the outside world. That requires a sort of very, very high degree of precision, right? That requires a very, very accurate notion of mapping between mental states and the outside world. It seems very likely that for the vast majority of the inferences that we make, for the vast majority of what we do on a daily basis, for the vast majority, even of fairly complex scientific inferences, and Dan Dennett likes to point, in particular, when we talk about science, to the fact that we can know when we're wrong and self-correct, right, as an important element of the response to Plantinga's argument. Because we know, I mean, just like, so, you wear glasses, right? Dennett makes this argument that part of wearing glasses is realizing, guess what? We're perfectly capable of realizing when our eyeballs aren't giving us the truth about the world around us. And so we go out and we build things to put between our eyeballs and the outside world to make our eyeballs give us the truth about the outside world, right? One thing that might lead you to believe that we don't need that kind of perfect one-to-one mapping to be able to have perfectly functional theories and interactions with the outside world, theories that we ought to call true, right? Again, remember this, what we're playing with here is what gets to be called true beliefs, what get to be called true theories, or true enough, approximately true, reasonably corresponding. Take your favorite pick of vocabulary here. The more you start to think about it, the more it seems that expecting 100% correspondence, expecting 100% truth, just doesn't really jive with the way in which we actually use those kinds of beliefs on a daily basis. Epistemology is just a lot more complicated than that. It's not like we look at the world, we obtain a bunch of completely solid propositional knowledge about the world, we make a bunch of deductive inferences from that, cognitively clear deductive inferences from that knowledge and then act, right? Human psychology is a lot nastier than that. We are messy, bad, mostly irrational creatures. It seems pretty plausible to me that a theory of truth should be making some strides to take account of that. Now, again, how exactly to pull that off? I don't have a detailed story for you, but I know that there's a story there, and if driving us to clarify that story is what Plantinga's argument does, I think that's not a problem. I think that's okay, right? That's not necessarily a bad thing if what the result of his critique is forcing those of us who are interested in in naturals, to get clearer about what we mean by truth. And I know this is one thing. For example, I've already mentioned LSU. That's one thing he's spent some time thinking about. I've seen one lecture that he gave on this topic. That's a good thing, right? That's a good thing. And so at least we could point to that as a potential positive.
So is Plantinga saying that there's kind of a dichotomy? Either there's a complete one-to-one mapping, or we can't be sure about our own reasoning.
Yeah. So Plantinga thinks that the correspondence theory of truth, which is, so I don't think I actually officially defined that. The correspondence theory of truth is just this idea that what it means for a proposition to be true is that the propositional content corresponds in a one-to-one way with the outside, with the relevant facts in the outside world. Plantinga thinks the correspondence theory of truth is the only viable theory of truth. And so he thinks that either our beliefs are true in the sense of the correspondence theory, or they are not true. Right? It's not a vague concept for him, right? There is a very clear, very straightforward set of necessary and sufficient conditions for what it is for something to be true, at least as far as I've read the argument. And so, yeah, you either get it or you don't, right? You've either got it or you haven't got it. And if you don't have a way to get it reliably, and evolution wouldn't be a way to get it reliably on his view, then you don't have it at all.
Okay, and so that would be kind of a false dichotomy flag to be raised.
That's always been my inclination in response to this argument. Yeah, my inclination has always been to say, if that's what you mean by truth, then that's where I've got to start disagreeing with you, because I think we've got to be more subtle and nuanced, given what we know about real world human psychology. If only because, I think if that's what we mean by truth, there's lots of reasons to think that we don't have any true beliefs, not just evolution, right? There's all kinds of well-confirmed biases in human thought, right? Any of which, it seems to me, might well result with a Plantinga-style argument in the idea that we don't have any true beliefs, if that's what we need for truth. I mean, we're all very good at confirmation bias. We're all very good at, go down the list, right? We've gotten a lot.
Backfire effect and all that.
Yeah, the behavioral econ and psychology literatures are now just filled with really, really, really empirically well-confirmed examples of people being really bad at thinking in very clear ways. That's fine. Philosophy can catch up, and we're starting to do that, I think. But it's a very old academic discipline.
Right. So, any more notes to add to that?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, it's an interesting argument. There's a number of, like I say, there's a number of different ways to sort of resist and get off the bus. And yeah, let me close by saying, do go read the Sober and Fiddleston stuff. It's really nice. And like I say, I don't have time to summarize it here, but that's another highly recommended, heartily recommended response.
Okay. So my next question involves the use and misapplication of the term historical science by apologetic ministries in an attempt to sort of cut science in half.
Good.
What are your thoughts on that?
So, I think on the one hand, it is absolutely fair to point to some kind of a distinction between something like historical and experimental sciences. So the sort of locus classicus in the philosophical and philosophy of science literature on this topic has been a philosopher, Carol Cleland at Colorado Boulder. Her work is really fantastic, and I like the way that in the final analysis she boils down the distinction between historical and experimental sciences. So what she says is there's a fundamental asymmetry between the past and the future, right? The problem is when we turn toward the future, we're trying to do science involving conclusions that we haven't seen yet. We can very precisely control current setups, and we can only very poorly predict future outcomes, right? Now turn to the past. We have no control over the conditions that applied in the past, but we have really good insight into some of the outcomes from the past. Right? Namely, if you dig up a fossil of it, it was there. Get very solid data. That sort of causal dichotomy rupture, if you will, right? There's no running from that. The past and the future are not the same. This is not an earth-shattering thing for anybody to say, right? But does that mean? So I mean, the question is now what you have to do. So step one is sort of acknowledge what the real scope of the distinction between historical and experimental sciences is. Step two is don't let that be used as a cudgel against the historical sciences. And I mean, yes, so yeah, sure, creationists love to use this as a cudgel, but I mean, theoretical physicists sometimes use this as a cudgel, right? People will refer to natural history as stamp collecting, right? This is a very old critique. This is an easy way to beat up on science you don't like. Now, how do you stop that? Well, I think the best way to stop that, I think there's a couple of good ways to kind of fight this sort of facile rejection of all the historical sciences. One, point out how many historical sciences there actually are, right? So, of course, most of astrophysics, obviously a decent amount of planetary science, anything in the history of life, of course, including evolutionary theory. Depending on how you define, again, we could get back into parsing what do we mean about talking about unobservables, but many of the same kind of arguments that if you're going to reject all of historical sciences, it's not the same because they're not historical per se, but you can sort of adapt many of those arguments to apply to things like particle physics as well. So that's step one, is realize it's not like evolution is the only historical science in town. You're throwing out a lot of baby, even if you think that evolution is bathwater. The other thing to say is you've got to understand that there are still quality and good and bad methods, high quality and low quality methods in historical sciences, just like there are in experimental sciences. And this is the thing about science, right? Sit down an experimental scientist, sit down someone who works in natural history, tell them, give me 15 examples of a crap journal article, right? It will not take them long. Everybody knows of examples of bad science. Sure. Precisely because we're very good at figuring out this is what good method looks like, this is what bad method looks like. And there's been some really great work, not as much as I might like, there's been some really great work trying to look at what are the sort of canonical features of good historical science method. So, I mean, yeah, we all know, I mean, to be fair, as an aside, the classical, five-step, three-panel science fair project board picture of experimental science is even wrong for experimental science. Let's be very clear. That kind of scientific method, there's no such thing as a univocal scientific method, even in the experimental sciences. Right. That's madness. But we've been thinking for a long time about what constitutes good experimental scientific method. That much is exactly right. That goes at least back to Bacon, and really it goes all the way back to Aristotle. Probably it goes back further than that. But we've got a lot of thought in these matters. We could probably use to give more thought to the sort of differences between good and bad historical scientific method, although, again, practicing scientists are doing this all the time, right? It's sunk less far, less deeply into the public conscience, right? People sort of, a lot of everyday persons on the street I can sort of describe an experiment to you, and you could go, yeah, that seems like a bogus experiment. Like, I don't think that's going to give you the data that, the answer to the question that you think it's going to give you, right? It's a lot harder because people are much less exposed to it if you describe, look, here's how I'm going to make an inference about the divergence time of chimpanzees and humans from their last common ancestor, right? It's much harder for the person on the street to go, oh yeah, that looks like a bad method, right? It's because people kind of don't have nearly as much of an idea of what really goes on in those. So how do we make those judgments? What do those models look like? They're really complicated. That difference in public perception is real, right? And so there is a very strong kind of public resistance when we tell people, no, look, there really are good examples, clear examples of good and bad historical scientific method. There is certainly some resistance because people don't know how to recognize it themselves. But you can absolutely make those distinctions. And so that's what matters. What matters is there's good and bad science everywhere, and figure out how to tell the good science apart from the bad science.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on using like experimental science to confirm historical science, like Neil Shubin finding Tiktaalik based on a prediction?
I love that example. Actually, I use that example all the time. without fail, it's always a great day in my intro history and philosophy of science course. When I use it as an example, it's like goes to the library, pulls out the geologic atlas, boom, I ought to fly there. He flies there for 2 seasons and finds exactly what he's looking for. Well played, sir. Those kinds of interactions are phenomenal, and what you get in those cases, so this is one of the things actually that Cleland has spent some time talking about. One good hallmark of good historical science, and that's a perfect example, are what you might call smoking gun instances. So not every historical science uses has to make its inferences this way, but certainly a quality case. Tiktaalik is a great smoking gun. The iridium layer at the Cretaceous extinction is another great smoking gun. It's like, look, how else is this thing going to be here? There's no other rate. I mean, no good reason for why there'd be an iridium layer at 65 million years, right, unless there was some kind of an asteroid impact. There's not that much iridium on the planet. Same thing for Tiktaalik. There's no good reason that the northern Canadian shale or wherever exactly he was, right? There's no reason that exact piece of rock has that exact piece of fossil in it, unless we pretty much know what we're talking about. We've kind of got this thing figured out. That I think I like Cleland pointing that out. So that's a canonical example of good historical science method. You can also, of course, the other thing to say is not all of evolution is natural history. This is an important point in the apologetics context, right? Sure, some of evolution is natural history, but Richard Lenski's long-term evolution experiment at Michigan State is not natural history. They just had a birthday party. I forget how many tens of thousands of generations. Oh. They just hit another big round number of lots of generations, and they had like a bacteria birthday party. I saw it. That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, that's not natural history. That's experiment. And in fact, not only is it sort of let it run and read the results experiment, but because they've got the frozen library, actually, Zachary Blount, a postdoc in that lab, wrote a great chapter in the Chance and Evolution book on the long-term evolution experiment. Because they've got the frozen library, they can go replay life's tape in real life, right? That's experimental science. Yeah, they don't know what they're going to get when they do that. They weren't sure, right? They weren't, in particular, what they weren't sure. So the novel mutation, right, is the ability to consume citrate in one of the lines of bacteria. So they went back to the ancestors before that evolved, and they weren't sure would it be more likely for the recent ancestors before the ability was evolved. Were they sort of pre-adapted? There's a lot of debate in evolution about whether or not there are such things as pre-adaptation, right? To what extent and in what way do sort of evolutionary lineages get themselves ready for novelty, right? So if you go back and you pick somebody fairly soon before that ability was developed, will they be much more likely to evolve that ability later on because they were like, they got ready for it? And if I'm recalling the paper right, the answer was yes, actually. So they've started to track the history of that, how that mutations have slowly evolved into the population. That's full-on experimental science. That's just exactly like going out and trying to test the properties of some fluid dynamics system or something, right? Mm-hmm. Just like any other experimental scientist would. So that's another important, again, especially in the I often don't lean on that example when I teach this distinction, because of course I don't want people to think that there's a sense in which that's a bit of a cop-out, right? You don't want people to think that because you point to the experimental science cases that you're sort of agreeing with the fact that the historical science is crap, because you're not. Mm-hmm. You can point to the experimental science while still supporting the historical science, the validity of all the historical science work that goes on. I think it's important for us to do both.
Yeah. Microraptor was also predicted about 100 years before it was discovered by a guy named Charles William Beebe.
Cool.
He predicted there should be a stage in bird evolution where they would have the asymmetrical flight feathers on the front and the back limbs.
Oh, that's awesome. I don't know that case study. I'm going to have to go, hang on. I'm going to actually make myself a note. That's a really cool...
He named it Tetrapteryx. Tetrapteryx. Tetrapteryx.
That's an awesome case study. Yeah.
And there was another one for the mammal-like reptiles where this guy, I think it was Crompton or something. No, Crompton was the one who described it. Can't remember Broom. That was his name. Broom. Broom was this guy who theorized that if mammals are descended from reptiles, there should be a point where we have a double jaw. It's like,
oh, sure.
yeah, and so Diarthrognathes was was discovered long after it was predicted.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting. So we can segue. I think this is something else that you were interested in talking about. That's a nice segue. I mean, there's a very interesting and very long debate in the philosophy of science about the difference between scientific explanation and scientific prediction.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Is there one? First of all, notably, so a number of philosophers have actually made the claim. Look, all you're doing is you're showing that some particular piece of data follows from, is expected by, is a consequence, in some sense of consequence, of the body of scientific theory. It doesn't matter if you've seen it already or not, right? You're still just demonstrating that what we know about evolution is right, this thing should be there. And if we've already seen it, great. If we haven't already seen it, well, go look for it. The only difference is, a prediction, because we haven't seen it yet, could potentially go wrong, whereas an explanation, if you've already seen it, then you've already seen it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of debate, though, about that sort of symmetry thesis, as it's known. I think there's good reason to think that it might be right. It depends a lot, though, on how we understand sort of scientific explanations more generally, and what we think about the distinction between the various kinds of arguments that you might be using, when you make a scientific explanation. So, classically, a few probably scientific explanations are going to be merely deductive, right? So here you might just be talking about, I don't know, in a Newtonian world, if I, start the ball rolling at the top of the hill, it'll wind up at the bottom of the hill, and that's just a straightforward logico-mathematical consequence of the laws plus the initial conditions. Cool, good to go. That looks just like a deductive or logical argument. But then there's lots of other kinds of argument too that seem to be deployed regularly. So there's, of course, there's inductive arguments where, look, we've seen the same thing over and over again. We've seen the same behavior happen over and over again. We should probably go ahead and infer it's pretty likely that that's telling us what's really going on, right? So sort of an inference from a lot of instances to a sort of general underlying principle. And what you see more and more these days is what we, in the technical term, often call this an abductive inference, or an inference to the best explanation, right? Which is, look, if, actually, smoking guns, right? We've already been here. What's the best explanation for there being an iridium layer at the Cretaceous extinction? There's pretty much only one, right? It's a meteor impact. Or similarly, there's a plausible argument to be made that basically that's what Darwin is doing in the last third of The Origin of Species. He's saying, look, here's a bunch of data all over the natural world. I'm going to talk about instincts, and I'm going to talk about biogeography, and I'm going to talk about embryology, and I'm going to talk about fossil distribution, and I'm going to talk about, he kind of rattles topics off through the last 5 or 6 chapters, right? And what he's saying is, look, if you buy evolution, all this stuff makes perfect sense. I have a great explanation for all of these. If you don't believe in evolution, you need an independent explanation for every single one of these facts, right? Why would a creator have decided to put on the Galapagos organisms that look more like what's in Ecuador than like what's on other tropical islands? That's dumb. If a creator had any good sense, tropical islands would get the same stuff, right? What would explain it? What would explain it is they were from Ecuador. They floated over there. Perfect, right? Here's a better explanation. How to make those explanations work, whether or not abductive inference is a legitimate form of inference. Challenging stuff. A bunch of really good contemporary philosophy of scientists have been on exactly this topic right now, right? Probabilistically, how do you understand what's going on when you make an abductive inference? How do you know that you're making a real, good, legitimate abductive inference and not just a guess? What do you do if you're making the inference to the best explanation you have, but all of your explanations are bad, right? These kinds of cases, we're trying to figure out how to kind of nail down some of this stuff around the edges, but there's a bunch of really good work going on this. And this gets right back at this question of the relationship between experimental and historical sciences, because realistically speaking, at any point in many of these sciences, you're going to see lots of these different kinds of explanations, maybe all of these different kinds of explanations being deployed at different times in different ways. And plausibly, I think it's fair to say, that's the more interesting thing. for what's going on. What should we actually be excited about? So this is philosophy of science, with my philosopher of science hat on, right? What should we be more excited about going on in these sort of bizarre cases? It's look at these weird and interesting explanations that they're using. They don't look like explanations everywhere else. Not everything looks like theoretical physics, and that's okay, right? But what does it look like? How should we understand how it looks? Yeah, there's a lot of cool, really good work going on there right now.
Yeah, that kind of gets us to the next question I want to ask, which came from an apologist, and I don't usually see this kind of argument. I think it's maybe close to the bottom of the barrel apologist, but it is something I've heard, and I was interested to know the answer, and that's the affirming the consequent in science. If you have a hypothesis and your hypothesis turns out to be true, then you have affirmed the consequent. And your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bizarre argument for a variety of reasons. We were talking earlier. I haven't been exposed to it before. Now, but I can hazard a few guesses. I mean, so the first thing to say, of course, is that affirming the consequent is a deductive fallacy. And while some, again, think Newtonian physics, some arguments in the sciences are likely deductive, most of them seem not to be. This is a very, very classic sort of intro philosophy of science stuff. Right? Sorry.
I think that says something about the
random
argument
guy. This is sort of intro phil science stuff. But even if we look just at the deductive case, there's several things to say. So one, of course, is that consequent is not a temporal notion; it's a logical notion, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that like you got it later. That doesn't make it the consequent, right? Mm-hmm. But the other thing to say is, so imagine say we have a very classic. A very classic deductive case. I'm trying to give this person as many things as I can give them. Devil's advocate this thing as hard as I know how. So we give this. So we have a classic case of what we're pretty sure is a deductive explanation in science. So take one of these Newtonian cases. So you're going to infer that if you start the ball up here, it's going to wind up down there. And that does seem to be a deductive consequence of Newton's laws plus some statements about the initial conditions. Cool. Well, the other thing that's important is just so that you see the result that you expected provides a certain kind of evidence, right? Okay, cool. What's the relationship of that evidence to sort of confirming Newtonian mechanics, right? That's a very different kind of question, right? Because notably, that argument is only deductively valid if we go in having Newton's laws be universally valid, exceptionless regularities. So every single ball that you place in that position will behave in exactly the same manner, right? That's the only way that argument's deductively valid, right? Otherwise, if Newton's laws are only hold sometimes, well, it's not good enough. You still don't have a deductive. You have an invalid. You have a bad deductive argument. So now there's a weird thing here where it almost seems like the only time that science does anything that looks like predicting something as a logical consequence are in cases where we either have or have assumed for the sake of argument that the laws are true already anyway, right? So it's not like you're then going to go on to say, and the fact that the ball rolled down meant that Newton's laws were right. Well, no, the argument wouldn't have worked if you wouldn't have had a deductive argument if Newton's laws were wrong. You would have had a bad deductive argument if Newton's laws were wrong. So I have a hard time figuring out where that's going to cut any ice. Yeah. Maybe I'm misinterpreting something somewhere, but I can't find a place where I feel like there's anything like that that's going on that is in any sense an objection.
I mean, I think it's not so much, and I think there's a reason for this, that it's not so much used among the more philosophic apologists, that it's more of like the street apologist who's got these soundbite arguments that they kind of want to throw out there, but they really don't understand the implications of said argument. Yeah,
LSU's free speech alley is famous for attracting the trolls. I try to tell the students not to feed the trolls, but nobody listens. Everybody feeds the trolls. But that's okay.
It's just so much fun.
I know. But yeah, no, I mean there's certainly there's levels of discourse here, and there are people that, like I say, it's fun, interesting, and clever to engage with something like planting this evolutionary argument against naturalism. Even though I don't think it doesn't work. It's still an interesting argument, and the responses to the level of sophistication of the response that you need to have to is pretty high, right? It's a challenging and interesting case. Yeah, not so much every argument. Course.
I gotta say, I have a friend who works over at Foster Hall. I work over there in the mammalogy department, and I was over there talking at Free Speech Alley to one of the guys, and he kind of came by and he had his head down, just like trying to be as inconspicuous as possible as he walked by. Just thinking, I think maybe like, oh, please don't say hi.
I take the diversion underneath the bridge to the Union if they're really going after it.
Oh.
to try to dodge them. Yeah.
Understandable. There's really just one group in general that kind of is out there yelling at people.
Yeah, practically half the time it's that one guy.
Yeah,
Guy. I don't know that guy.
I know that guy.
Talk to that guy. You've talked to that guy. I don't. I'm okay not having talked to that
guy. Understandable. So let's see. It's almost 3. So I just have one more thing topic I'll air with you, and then we'll call it good, I guess.
Sure.
And that is the concept of scientism, because as we said, yeah, it has some merits, but I think it's also abused a lot.
Yeah, this is really good. So I mean, there's two. So I guess there's two common extremes that I at least would implore anybody to avoid. Right. The first is there's been an understandable, but I think mistaken reaction to sort of contemporary critiques of science, and that has been to take the position that science is the only way we have of knowing anything. Right? Look, in the history of the world, we have one reliable process for generating knowledge of empirical fact. It's science. Everything else is garbage. I get it, right? I get the allure. It saves you from having to have a lot of other arguments, and it saves you from having to nuance a lot of really careful nuance. It also makes you say really strange things, like that mathematics is a science. Or that it's impossible to learn anything from reading a good work of fiction, or engaging in literary criticism, or listening to the first movement of Mahler's 10th Symphony. And if you don't think you can learn anything from listening to the first movement of Mahler's 10th Symphony, go home and listen to the first movement of Mahler's 10th Symphony, and you'll learn things. Now that said, that then, you've got to balance that against the sort of anything goes kind of extreme, right? Classically, although I hate this, you'll see some of his work's actually been picked up, I learned the other day, by the alt-right, which is a little terrifying. Feyerabend, a philosopher of science, is famous for this doctrine that he most often called methodological anarchism. So he's a sort of, this classic way to sloganize this is to actually say anything goes. So Feyerabend he was provocative in many ways for the sake of being provocative, right? He wanted to make a splash. He wanted people to pay attention to him. And so he would say stuff like, the NSF should fund research into dowsing rods, because if it works, then there would be, and otherwise you'll never know that it doesn't work. And everybody's like, all right, Feyerabend, chill a little bit, please. So, I mean, again, let me footnote that just to say, real-world Feyerabend is much more complicated and multifaceted than this. Right. Basically, what I just gave you is like the bad reading that the alt-right likes, so don't use that reading. But setting that aside, that's the other extreme that you don't want to fall into, right? You don't want to fall into this idea that, okay, because science isn't the only way of learning, and so every knowledge tradition teaches us everything all the time. And
kind of a postmodernist view.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, or what passes for the word postmodernism today, which doesn't even have nothing to do with what postmodernism actually means. But okay. I'm afraid that ship has sailed, so I'm not going to fight it. This idea that, so spirit healing is okay and crystals are okay now, and just like let everything ride, because, well, no, there are plenty of ways to land in the middle, and there are reliable knowledge-producing practices, there are unreliable knowledge-producing practices, and there are sham knowledge-producing practices, and you've got to figure out what you're holding. And that's really hard. You know, parts of science are super reliable, parts of science are fairly unreliable. I think we're actually pretty good these days. I don't think any of science falls all the way into the sham category, right? Like, we've done a pretty good job of maintaining the borders at least that well, right? You know, but then you could push the same thing. The same thing holds in the social sciences. The same thing holds in the humanities. The same thing holds in the arts. The same thing holds in, you know, go down the list, right? The same thing holds for religious traditions. And I think in a lot of cases, once you specify, right, where are they reliable and where are they unreliable, right? That's the important thing, but that's the important thing in every branch of human knowledge. And so, basically, you know, it's a sort of long-winded way to say that we should all just be more reflective about this, right? Because sometimes, yeah, you know, there are a decent number of sham knowledge practices in the contemporary world. You know, let's bash on crystals because that's like nice and safe and reasonably apolitical, right? Clearly a total fraud. I could go on, but I'm not gonna. Clearly a total fraud, right? We're stuck with some of these in the 21st century society, and we should be very clear and very frank about calling them out. There are, you know, people in the academy who get out of their lane and talk about stuff they don't know anything about, right? This happens all the time. That's not a reliable knowledge-producing practice, right? Because I'm a really good theoretical physicist, I don't necessarily have reliable insights into, I don't know whether or not we should have comparative literature departments, right? Like, cool, like, you don't necessarily know what even goes on over there. So that kind of thing, you know, that kind of thing happens, but it happens to everybody all over. This is the unfortunate sort of, you know, everybody should take philosophy. No, it's why we should all be more careful and more reflective, because we're all afflicted with this, right? This is a top to bottom kind of global concern. It's not as easy as drawing a dotted line around the camp that you want to be in and saying that everybody who's not on your team is a waste of space. We've all got to be more cautious than that, and it's hard, and it's would certainly be better if we didn't all have to do that. I'd rather not spend the time trying to figure out, you know, for the new flavor of the month, whether or not any of the people involved in the flavor of the month know what they're talking about. But we do. We're stuck with that sort of epistemic burden, if you will. So yeah, that's a long. That's a sort of the sense in which that's a really evasive answer. But it is, I think, the right answer. That this idea that you know, science has taken over some areas of inquiry that were not formerly science. That has in many cases been a good thing. It has in some cases been a neutral thing. But that's not the same, and nor should it be taken to be the same as, you know, science taking over the universe. We've all got to be more cautious than that. At least that's where I would come down.
Okay. Do you have any more notes on anything we've covered thus far? Anything you think would be a good note to add?
I don't think so. I think that's it. This was a lot of fun. If you ever want to stop back by, I'm here. So
okay.
This was really fun.
Yep. Thank you very much for having a talk with us today.
Appreciate it.